Every day, somewhere in America, more than 300 innocent men, women, and children become victims of medical malpractice at the hands of incompetent and negligent doctors. Last year, over 98,000 victims were killed by doctors. More than 4 million victims are permanently injured each year. In this insider exclusive network TV special, Justice in America, Jennifer Barnett's story, we visit with Jennifer's lawyer, Lloyd Bell. As we take you inside today's legal system, examining his legal strategies and in vivid detail, showing you the often heartbreaking stories of medical malpractice cases like Jennifer Barnett's. This was Jennifer Barnett prior to February 3rd, 2013. This is her today after a series of medical doctors and medical healthcare workers failed to properly diagnose her stroke symptoms and administer a life-saving, reasonable standard of care, which has dramatically changed her life. Here's Lloyd Bell to give you an insider's devastating critique of modern medical practices and an honest view of what our broken healthcare system looks like.
The reality of patient care today is there is room for significant concern. There was a study that came out recently from Johns Hopkins University, which found that of all the causes of death in America each year, medical malpractice accounts for the third leading cause of death. Medical malpractice, that's the equivalent of 2 jumbo jets loaded with passengers crashing every single day of the year. That is unacceptable in a modern country, a successful country such as the United States. So the reality is that there's a real problem out there. So roughly 1% of doctors cause about a third of all medical malpractice cases in America. 1%. So why aren't they being pushed out of medicine? Why aren't they being drummed out of the profession? And the answer to that is, I believe, part of it is politics. These are professionals who have their licenses, and they fight very hard to keep their licenses. And another reason that these doctors are allowed to continue practicing is they can move around. They can move from state to state. So if they get held accountable for medical malpractice in Georgia, they can move to other states in the country that have different laws that may be willing to allow them to practice. So it's a real problem. And the biggest problem is that patients don't know this. They don't know who those doctors are. You know, doctors are humans, just like all of us. And like human beings, we all make mistakes, including doctors. But there's something about a medical mistake, a professional mistake, that so many doctors are reluctant just to say they're sorry, just to look the family in the eye and say, I am very sorry, I made a mistake. It's hard for anybody to do that, but I have seen that it's extremely hard for a doctor to do that. And it's unfortunate. There have been studies that have come out that prove and demonstrate that if doctors will just accept responsibility and admit their mistakes, that families and victims of malpractice are far less likely to sue. As more and more hospital groups are acquiring smaller doctors and more doctors are practicing together, it seems like communication between the professionals is decreasing. People will communicate, doctors will communicate through electronic medical records, but they don't talk to each other like they used to. They don't pick up the phone and say, Dr. Jones, I see you sent this patient to me for this reason. What's going on with this patient? Talk to me. They don't have the face-to-face communications like they used to. They essentially hide in the computer. They hide in the medical record. And they say, well, if I put it into the medical record, the people that need to see it will see it. So the lack of communication is a real problem among the professionals. Another big change that needs to happen is a movement away from this assembly line factory mentality of caring for patients. Some doctors, primary care doctors, will see 60, 70 patients in a day. You can't see that many patients in a day. You can't even barely get to know somebody's name with that many patients in a day. The old days where a doctor would actually sit down with the patient, look them in the eye, tell me what's going on, spend time with them, get to know them over a period of time. It just doesn't happen as much as it needs to. So that's another change. There needs to be greater communication. There needs to be more time spent between the doctor and the patient. One last thing I would offer as well is there needs to be less reliance on other specialties to do your job. If you're the doctor and you're caring for a patient, that is your patient. And it's good to involve other specialties, That's helpful, that's needed sometimes, but that's still your patient. And too often, patients will be sent from Dr. A to Dr. B to Dr. C, and each of those doctors along the way will look at that patient through their specialized lens and not look at the whole patient. So it kind of ties into a lack of communication, but it also is a siloed kind of thinking where every specialist looks at the patient through their specialty lens and doesn't look at the whole patient. And patients fall through the cracks that way and they don't get the care that they need.
This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Atlanta, Georgia.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Lloyd Bell to the show. Welcome to the show, Lloyd.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Tell our audience a little bit about your practice of law. It seems like you do a lot of medical malpractice cases. Why?
I do a lot of medical malpractice cases. I've been practicing now for about 20 years, and I come by it rightfully. My father was a doctor. He was also a lawyer, and he sort of opened me up to the need for medical malpractice lawyers who are willing to take on these cases. These cases are extremely challenging, they're expensive, and they require a specialized interest in medicine. And on a more personal level, my brother was a victim of medical malpractice. He was a service member, and he served in Iraq, he served in Afghanistan, and was exposed to the chemicals in the atmosphere, and he developed lung cancer. And he came back to the States, and it was not diagnosed by the Veterans Administration for many, many months. They didn't give him the appropriate tests. And at the age of 53, he died of lung cancer. Medical malpractice is very personal to me, and I'm very committed to the victims of malpractice and trying to help them obtain justice.
Today we are here discussing another one of your clients, Jennifer Barnett. Tell our audience who Jennifer is.
Jennifer Barnett is a wonderful young woman who was married at the time this happened. She's got two beautiful boys, rambunctious sports boys who are always on a baseball diamond, it seems, and lives in rural Georgia, not too far from Athens, Georgia. And Jennifer and her husband, who's a commercial pilot, were up in New York City for business. He was training on a new aircraft and decided to bring his wife along and the kids to turn into a little mini vacation. He's going to be in class all day. They can run around New York City and have a lot of fun. That's what happened. On the way back on the aircraft, they were flying commercial. As the plane was about to land in Atlanta, Jennifer suddenly vomited on herself, lost consciousness, passed out. And when she woke up a few moments later, she wasn't able to talk. She wasn't able to move her limbs, her arms. And they called an ambulance. So the plane lands, ambulance arrives, they rush Jennifer to the hospital, and that's where the problems began.
Now, the EMTs that met her at the plane and took her to the hospital, right? They wrote some notes as to what they thought might be happening. What were those notes?
Well, the EMTs documented what they saw in part of their examination, and they documented that Jennifer had a right-sided weakness. Now, right-sided weakness or left-sided weakness, that is a classic sign of a potential stroke or a possible stroke. And the EMTs documented the right-sided weakness. When they got to the hospital, they passed along those same findings to the emergency department nurse, Nurse Brown. And they told him she's got a right-sided weakness, sudden onset of all these other problems. And Nurse Brown did not call a stroke alert to get the machinery in place to save Jennifer, because when you have a stroke, the clock is ticking and there is a limited amount of time in which a patient can be saved. The nurse didn't approach it, didn't call a stroke alert. When the emergency room doctor got involved, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Johnson didn't call a stroke alert either. She put stroke down in the medical records as a potential diagnosis, but she never called a stroke alert. And the time is just ticking off, hour after hour after hour.
And where is she during all this
She's
time?
in the emergency room.
Nothing's being administered at all.
Well, they're doing other things that don't matter. They didn't give her the test that she needed. They didn't evaluate her like they needed to. And if they called a stroke alert, then she would have gotten the interventions or the treatment she needed. There are only two. There are only two things that can really be done in this setting. The first one is to give medication called TPA, or clot buster, they call it. And if you think of your blood vessels as pipes in your house, the clot buster is like the liquid Drano. You get it into where the clot is, it dissolves the clot, it restores the blood flow, saves the patient. That's number one. Number two is instead of the liquid Drano, you send a snake down in there, what's called a thrombectomy, where you wind this little snake in there, grab the clot, pull it out. The key is you've got to restore blood flow before brain tissue starts dying, and there's a limited window to do that.
What is that limited window?
Well, for the liquid Drano or the clot buster, it's 4.5 hours from the onset of symptoms. So Jennifer had symptoms on the plane for the first time, and then she was in the hospital within an hour. She was well within the window to get this medication to clear out this clot. Now, the window to pull the clot or do the thrombectomy, the snake and the clot, is longer. It's as much as 7 hours. So if they had sent her and taken her to the hospital where she needed to go, which was Grady Memorial Hospital, they are well equipped to go in with a snake and to pull this clot and to restore her blood flow.
It's amazing. Why didn't they address this issue properly? They were aware of it.
That is the million-dollar question, and why they didn't do it. And there's no excuse. They absolutely should have done this. Nurse Brown had many years of education. He's an emergency department nurse. He had treated other stroke patients. I think they got deceived because Jennifer is younger, and you typically think of people with stroke as being older. Well, that's just a limitation on your own education, because young people have strokes too. Babies can have strokes. And when a person has a sudden mental alteration and a right-sided weakness, you think of stroke 100% of the time. For whatever reason, they didn't take strong action.
As a result of when did they finally address the fact that she had a stroke? How many hours later?
Oh, we're talking days later.
Days later.
Yeah. They kept her at the hospital for almost 24 hours before they sent her to another hospital, Emory Hospital, which has an excellent reputation for caring for stroke patients. And when she got to Emory, by then it was too late to do anything to help her recover. But they figured it out. They did the right imaging study, the right test, and they saw that she had had a massive stroke and there's brain damage, and she was not going to recover from it.
What has been the end result with Jennifer?
The end result is she has a condition which is known as locked-in syndrome. And locked-in syndrome means literally you're locked into your own body. Jennifer's mind, her ability to think, her ability to create ideas, all of that is intact. She still is Jennifer, but she can't move her body. She's got some very limited mobility with her arms that's come back with a lot of effort over the years. But she's confined to a wheelchair. She can't speak. She can mouth a little bit with her words, but she's very affected and will be for the rest of her life.
And this case is scheduled to go to trial, is that correct?
We are scheduled to start trial on December 2nd of this year, 2019.
You have settled against some of the defendants already, correct?
We've resolved the case against a number of the defendants, but there are two that remain in the case, and that would be the emergency department nurse Brown, as well as the emergency room physician, Dr. Hamilton.
What are they claiming? That they provided the reasonable standard of care? Is that it?
That's exactly what they're saying. Nurse Brown's saying that it's not really my job to call a stroke alert. It's the doctor's job. The doctor's saying it wasn't indicated to call a stroke alert. And then we ask her, so why did you document stroke as as the first item on your list of potential diagnoses? And she has no good explanation for that. But the undisputed fact is she never called a stroke alert. She never set in place the machinery that could have saved Jennifer, would have likely saved Jennifer.
How old is Jennifer now?
33 years old.
And this happened when she was 26?
29.
29. And unfortunately, she's never going to get better, right?
You know, you always have hope. Medical science progresses. things that we thought were impossible 10 years ago are now possible. So there is always hope. And Jennifer is a woman of deep faith and conviction, and she prays and she believes in the power of prayer. I believe in the power of prayer. I believe in the power of medical science. So there is hope. But she's always going to have some problems associated with this event.
Since you are well known for getting successful verdicts and settlements in medical malpractice cases, a lot of people will contact you. How do you determine the cases that you want to handle?
Well, unfortunately, we can't handle every case that comes to us. But we have to focus on the types of cases that we are best equipped to handle. So the first question we look at is, what has been the outcome of the supposed malpractice? It has to be, unfortunately, it has to be a catastrophic injury or a wrongful death. So that's the starting place. What's been the outcome? We see a lot of cases of medical malpractice where the potential client will approach us and explain a horrible situation they've been through, but if they've had a full recovery, that's not a case, unfortunately, we can take on. So we look at the injury, and then we get the medical records, and then we examine the medical records. We have a medical staff that's available to us to review the records, and we kind of put on our Sherlock Holmes hats and start investigating and start digging, and then we go through that process. We tell our client every step of the way what we're discovering, and then ultimately we have to make a decision. Is there malpractice? If yes, is it a case that we can proceed? And if it's not, we have a wide network of attorneys we refer cases to. But if it's a case that we take on, then obviously we'll bring all our resources into that case.
Good. Well, good luck with this case, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.